Hello again, everyone, and thanks once again for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather on this first day of August 2020. Up first, we've got rainfall over almost an inch and a half falling at King Salmon, while Kaliganik, they're off to the west-northwest of King Salmon, had about 3/4 of an inch of rain. Then on the southern Kenai Peninsula there on the Cook Inlet side of the Kenai Peninsula, the Nilchik had 2/3 of an inch of precipitation, and then on up to the north, west central interior, Portman had 1/2 inch, and probably will see rainfall amounts like this a little farther to the east into the Alaska Range, Tanana Valley area in the central interior over the next 24 hours. And moving on to fire danger, of course, that precipitation, fire danger is non-existent over much of Alaska. It has expanded, though, especially into the high to very high danger up over the Yukon Flats area and over toward the border. Temperatures today in the upper 70s to lower 80s up there with, Chalkyitsik having 83 degrees at 3 p.m. this afternoon, while Beaver had 82. So that gave a boost to the fire danger up in that area. And then the only other location is a small area around Gulkana there in the Copper River Basin, high to barely high fire danger, and that mostly due to the gusty south winds up to 25 miles an hour experiencing today with the no rainfall has occurred there. There's been rainfall off to the east, but that's barely into the high category. In fact, that'll probably be gone tomorrow. And from there, moving on to the Mendenhall Lake at lake level, hit 11.53 feet today earlier, and that just fell short. The record, the all-time record height is 12 feet, so it came very close to tying the record and expecting it to start down. And therefore, the flood warning is extended until 7 p.m. Saturday evening, so a few more hours from now, which time they'll it'll either end or they'll kick it out longer. And that's for Mendenhall Lake and River near Juneau, and obviously the river flowing pretty good there, pretty good current there on the river. And again, that warning's out until at least 7 p.m. Saturday evening. Otherwise, there's flood watches continue out for tonight, tomorrow night into early Monday morning. For the greater Fairbanks area, the Chattanooga and the Little Chena and Chattanooga rivers, flood watches out there. And then also for the small streams along the Elliott Highway, they're farther to the west. And now it includes also the eastern Alaska Range there, including Isabel Pass for copious amounts of rain. They're expected to fall tonight and tomorrow night. So flood watches for all those areas continue. And satellite imagery showing low pressure off the southeast coast, bringing minimum gale force winds to the coastal areas there on up to the eastern North Gulf Coast. Gusts to 45 to as high as 50 miles an hour in the coastal areas there. And even Juneau seeing a peak wind gust of about, 33 miles per hour with areas of rain, of course, clouds there. And Ketchikan catching winds to 30 miles an hour as well. But rainfall not all that impressive. Skagway picked up about 1/4 inch in the 12-hour period ending at 3 p.m. today, while Craig, farther to the south, had about 0.05 of an inch and just under 1/2 inch falling at Yakutat. And that system pulling up to the northwest there, that's going to be increasing the moisture along the North Gulf Coast and Prince William Sound up into the Copper River Basin tonight and tomorrow and the following day. Otherwise, you can see some clearing northern Susitna Valley into the central interior, on up into the Koyukuk Valley, upper Yukon Valley areas, Fairbanks upper 70s at mid-afternoon. And again, lower 80s there up over the Yukon Flats. And then that band of clouds there along the western interior from the western Brooks Range North Slope all the way down into northeast Bristol Bay, where king salmon picked up, as we saw, over almost 1.5 inches of precipitation in the 24-hour period ending this afternoon. But then farther to the west looked like sunshine, or there was sunshine over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta today. Kuskokwim Bay just about cloud-free at satellite picture time here, with Togiak Bay also mostly clear. And not a bad day over the Alaska Peninsula, with breaks in Norton Sound and some sunshine along the northwest coast, with offshore northeasterly winds there. Out to the west, low pressure, southwest Bering Sea, and you can see the front pushing in toward the Pribilof Islands, or at least a trough, but included front, and we'll see spinning there, another trough back to the west coming out of the main low center. All that shifting eastward. That's slowly, and then also along the Bristol Bay, an upper level low that's slowly moving eastward as that the system off the Panhandle moves northwestward. They'll kind of link up and combine. But on the chart here, you can see that front pushing in toward Unmak Island, and still west of the Pribilofs. Looks like possibly a few sun breaks over the Pribilofs today in advance of that system. But windy, winds gusting 35 miles an hour to the west-southwest at Adak, and they picked up about 1/4 inch of precipitation, and pretty breezy conditions all the way out to Shemya and Attu. Otherwise, isolated showers over the north slope and the eastern and western Brooks Range, with some thunderstorm lightning strikes showing up on the north coast of the Panhandle today. Ahead of that trough and low pressure area that's pulling northwestward and weakening, and lighter amounts of precipitation down to the south, and the heavier amounts, which I mentioned weren't all that heavy, under 1/2 inch at Yakutat, some areas of rain along the North Gulf Coast, into the eastern Copper River Basin, only a few hundreds to the west there, like at Eureka, and isolated thunderstorms over the Alaska Range, and really not much over the interior in the way of thunderstorm activity is concerned. And for tonight, still a chance of thunderstorm lingers over the Alaska Range and the eastern interior, maybe back toward Tanana or the southern Koyukuk Valley, but nothing really widespread. Look for rain to increase there in the green shaded areas over the eastern interior. Low clouds, fog, drizzle, areas of the Arctic coast. Basically dry there in the western interior with just isolated showers, but low clouds and fog quite prevalent over the eastern Bering into the coastline through the Bering Strait, and then that system spreads rain, fog, and drizzle into the Pribilof Islands and western Alaska Peninsula. Look for some showers for Kodiak Island, and basically dry for Cook Inlet, but rain increasing on the east side of the Kenai Peninsula and up into Prince William Sound. And the outlook for Sunday. Tomorrow, thunderstorms isolated again, rain moderate, possibly heavy at times over the eastern interior areas, and low pressure continues to track eastward over the eastern Aleutians, and then that'll track eastward across the Alaska Peninsula on Monday. Rain for the Panhandle, wet and cool over southern Alaska, a little drier to the north. Lows tonight, 50s over the interior and 30s on the Arctic coast, followed by highs tomorrow. Not all that warm, cooler even over the upper Yukon Valley. Still some 70s showing up, Eagle and Tok, Northway. Otherwise 60s for the Panhandle, lower 60s for southern Alaska, and lows in the 50s, and then highs the next day near 40 on the Arctic coast, and basically in the 60s over the interior, lower to mid for the Panhandle, but near 70 for Eagle and Northway and also Tok.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, marginal VFR with some IFR from the Brooks Range on out to the Arctic coast, but VFR, western Arctic coast and western interior along the Yukon River Valley all the way out to the Delta. VFR, Norton Sound as well, Kobuk Koyukuk Valley, Selawik Valley, Kotzebue on up toward Kivalina. Noatak Valley VFR, IFR along the central western Alaska Range, the Aleutian Range, mostly IFR for the Aleutians and Bering Sea. Marginal VFR, south central Alaska with IFR eastern North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle, IFR along the central and south coast of the Panhandle, otherwise marginal, and for Sunday afternoon. Marginal VFR, Kodiak Island, right on up across the western Kenai Peninsula into the Kuskokwim Valley, Cook Inlet, Madnuska, Susitna Valley, northward, right on up, and then expands as it approaches the Brooks Range there over the Koyukuk Valley with IFR from the crest of the mountains on out to the eastern Arctic coast, VFR to the west, some marginal VFR over the southwest mountains, but IFR off the coast from the Bering Strait, covering much of the Bering Sea and just about all of the Aleutians. Marginal for the Alaska Peninsula. IFR south coast, though, of the peninsula up to Sitkinak and the Gulf of Alaska, right on up into Prince William Sound and the North Gulf Coast. Southern Panhandle IFR. Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, northern areas IFR with marginal VFR in between. Moving on to Monday morning, we've got IFR, Brooks Range, eastern central north slope, Arctic coast, IFR. VFR there, Kotzebue Sound and Noatak Valley in toward the Nulato Hills and Norton Sound. And mostly VFR in the interior, some marginal VFR there in the central interior, but IFR again, Gulf of Alaska, much of the Panhandle now, all of Kodiak Island, up into Kamishak and Kachemak Bays, probably Resurrection Bay as well, and the western Alaska Range. IFR still pretty well entrenched, solid IFR for the Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula, and still pretty well entrenched for the Bering Sea. And that gives way a little bit, but that's out over the central Bering, goes marginal. Otherwise, IFR for the Aleutians to False Pass, right up toward Cape Newenham. Marginal VFR right along the southwest coastline there. Kuskokwim Bay, though, VFR. Right on up Kuskokwim Valley, mostly VFR, some marginal VFR over the mountainous terrain. IFR, a narrow band there, persists into the afternoon Monday. Along the Alaska Range, on up toward Windy Pass. IFR, northern Panhandle, along the eastern border and along the coast, otherwise marginal. And VFR, Manuska Valley, right on into the Copper River Basin, northward across the upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country to the Yukon Flats. And passes Anatuvik, IFR. Same forecast for Adigan, occasional IFR throughout the day. Sunday, Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR. Rainy, marginal. Windy, marginal at times. Isabel looking marginal. Mintastogo, marginal VFR, southern entrance, otherwise VFR through the pass and to the north. Tanita, marginal VFR at times. Portage, mostly IFR. Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 8,000 feet. Copper River Basin to the Susitna Valley down to Kodiak Island, and back up toward 10,000 feet Dixon Entrance, 10,000 feet northeast interior, 6,000 feet western Arctic coast, and 6,000 feet there, a little cool air aloft over the southern Bering Sea and the central Aleutians. Icing could be some considerable moderate rime icing along the southeast coast and the eastern North Gulf Coast around Yakutat, as well as up in toward the Tanana Valley through Windy Pass there on up to the White Mountains. Otherwise, areas of isolated moderate across southern Alaska and northward to the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And the jet stream, upper level low over Prince William Sound, tracking eastward. Another one there over the Aleutians with the 6,000 foot freezing levels we saw a moment ago. On the south side of that, 110 knot jet. The jet really staying south of the forecast area, but does cut northward there at 85 knots across the southern Panhandle. 9,000 feet, low pressure, southern Bering Sea. That's where the strongest winds will be, 25 to 40 knots just south of the Aleutians, 25 knots southeasterlies, eastern Gulf of Alaska, and 25 to 35 knot winds with that Aleutian low that's tracking eastward, light over the interior. Turbulence, occasional moderate chop for the Aleutians below 8,000 feet, light to isolated moderate chop for the north coast of the Panhandle, up along the North Gulf Coast into Prince William Sound, and also central Alaska Range.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. As you well know, you can get forecast information for any day of the week. Today, tonight, tomorrow, out to 6 or 7 days. It includes the high and low temperature, the wind direction, the chance of rain or snow in your part of Alaska. But did you know that there is information available to forecast out to 2 weeks? So the question is, how would you use that information? And here to answer that question today and tell us a lot more about climate services from the U.S. National Weather Service Alaska region is Rick Toman. He's the program manager for the Climate Science and Services. And Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
How would we use information that is out to 2 weeks instead of just the high and low and the chance of rain?
Well, Dave, as we move out in time, of course, forecasts become more uncertain. So as we move into that second week from now, we're not looking at specific highs or lows or precipitation amounts at any given place. What we can do with the state of the science at this point is get a handle on patterns. So we can say things like increased chances for stormy weather in the Bering Sea in 2 weeks, or we've been in a cold weather pattern, looks like 8 to 10 days from now, that pattern's going to change. Those are the kind of forecasts that we can currently make in that second week.
So you're increasing lead time for perhaps big or small weather events and telling us the likelihood of maybe more coastal storms or wind events in some areas?
Those are the kinds of things that we hope to be able to let Alaskans know in the second week forecast. And if you have an activity or an event that you would find that kind of advance notice useful, whether it's moving stuff off of the beach, whether to go out hunting or to come back from camp, those kind of decisions, the week 2 provides the opportunity for you to get a handle on that kind of information.
Okay. What other type of weather impacts that we're familiar with might Alaskans use climate services for?
Well, in the forecast realm, we can go provide some information from this week 2, say the 8 to 14 day period, on out to the monthly and even seasonal time scale. Now, those monthly seasonal forecasts are still kind of just really very much pattern dependent, and the amount of detail that we can provide at this point is still pretty limited. Generally, indications of how temperature and precipitation will fall in maybe above normal, below normal kind of range. But in the week 2 period, we can be considerably more specific than that as far as the general patterns and really the impacts on Alaskans.
Okay, so we would be talking about generalizations there that would tell us that the period might be more stormy, might be more hot, more dry, more cold, and situations like that.
That's correct. So we're not going to be able to say in which community, for instance, there's the threat of coastal flooding, but we can often be able to tell we're moving into a pattern that would be conducive to big Bering Sea storms. So if you're in an area that could potentially impact you, you'll want to pay attention to the weather forecast.
Okay. Now, every day and every hour of the day, the National Weather Service is working on a forecast for the next day. But how do you start your forecast process for that extended period that goes out beyond 7 days?
Well, the way things work right now, we start off with the expected general flow pattern for Alaska and the whole world, really, and then we narrow that down to Alaska. So we start off with the basic computer model forecast. There's quite a few different computer models that we look at, bring those together. And then another important part of that is we attempt to assess the confidence. The reality is often 2 weeks away, the computer models are very divergent. They have lots of different solutions, and that's an indication that we don't have much confidence. But when we see more agreement in that time frame, and when that agreement is a pattern that will be potentially very impactful for Alaska or is a big change from what we've been in, that's when we can then take that expected pattern. We have computer models forecasting it. We've assessed the confidence. Now we can move that forward. How, using our experience as Alaskan weather forecasters, how does that typically play out for Alaska? So is this a stormy pattern for the Bering Sea? Is this an extra rainy period for Southeast? Is this the kind of pattern that generates strong winds potentially in the Anchorage Bowl? Is this a deep cold pattern for the interior? All of those are the kind of things that we're looking at in these large-scale patterns. That's very different than telling you that the winds on 10 days from now are going to be gusting to 120 on the hillside. We're looking for patterns, not the very specific information that the Weather Service will then hone in on as the event gets closer.
So the idea is to keep the 5, 6, 7 day forecast the same, where you are getting the standard high and low temperature and the chance of wind or rain, but further out you get a broad general forecast, but as the time gets closer to that event, we'll get a lot more specific.
That's correct.
Okay, very good. So how can people use this information if I am out in the bush and I want to see, is a coastal storm expected in my region, or is a chance for that improving over the next 2 to 3 weeks, where could I go to get information like that?
When we see that potentially impactful or a big change in the weather is coming 8 to 14 days out, typically we will start to highlight that on the Weather Service Facebook site. We might produce a YouTube video highlighting that, linking that on our Facebook site. So often we don't, at this point, we don't have much to say in that because we're really looking for those forecasts of opportunities. But one thing we can say very likely as we go through the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be more and more of this kind of forecast information available in that week 2 time frame.
Okay, and something that emergency managers and city planners and folks in villages might be interested in keeping an eye out for, looking for that information to be headlined, whether that's on social media or perhaps through the National Weather Service channels there to get information from you to make better plans a little bit longer term and make better preparations in the event that things become a little bit more unsettled.
Absolutely. Climate Services with the National Weather Service Alaska region is talking to the state of Alaska every week, apprising them of that 2-week outlook. And on the social media side, we are working to keep Alaskans informed so that when we think we have some confidence in a high impact or a big change, that's the best way right now for folks to find out about that. Twitter, Facebook, so stay tuned to your National Weather Service.
Very good, a developing program. Rick Thoman with the National Weather Service Alaska region. He's the Climate Science and Services Program Manager. Thanks so much for joining us again, Rick, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Great, thanks, Dave.
For another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back. A little bit of a change in the sea ice there. You can see over toward Kaktovik some heavier ice, fair ways farther south than what was on the chart yesterday. But back to the west, there north of Point Barrow, it's up into the, it's pushed up into the banner there, and really no big changes expected over the next 5 days. For the coastal water forecast, southerlies 10 to 15 knots with 6-foot seas. So lighter winds tomorrow for the southeast coast there, but still small craft advisories on the extreme north coast for southeast winds at 25. Inside waters, southerlies 10 to 15 knots with 2 to 4-foot seas. Outlook for Monday, Lynn Canal, south winds at 20 with 4-foot seas, and southerly winds at 15 knots there for the Stevens Passage area, southeast at 10 for Clarence Strait with seas 2 feet. The south coast, southerlies 15 to 20 knots with 6-foot seas, southeast 20 knots on the north coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds at 15 knots with 4-foot seas. Otherwise, eastern North Gulf Coast looking at southeast winds at 20 with 8-foot seas. And then lighter winds, east 10 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, southeast 10 for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, southern Cook Inlet, southerlies of 15 knots and 10 knots north of the Forelands. For Monday, east winds 10 knots for Prince William Sound, seas 2 feet. East winds 10 knots also for Cook Inlet. Kamishak Bay, easterlies at 20 knots. Same forecast for the Barren Islands, 20-knot winds from the east with 5-foot seas. And east-southeast winds at 15 with 4-foot seas for the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island, east side there, southwest 15, Shelikof Strait southeast at 10. Southeast 10-knot winds also in the forecast for the Bristol Bay area. South to southeast 15 with 3 to 6-foot seas for the Alaska Peninsula. And for Monday, east 15 for Bristol Bay, north winds at 15 knots for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. South side, westerlies at 15 knots, Castle Cape to Sitkinak, south 15, southeast 20, east side of Kodiak Island, east 20 for Shelikof Strait. For Unalaska Island, southwest winds 20 knots, 6 to 9-foot seas. Unmak Island, southwest 20 to 25 knots with seas 8 to 12 feet. Small craft advisories for the Adak-Atka area, west winds 25 to 30 knots, 8 to 14-foot seas, and then 30-knot winds from the west for Amchitka Island, turn northwest 30 knots, Kiska, Shimei, and Attu. And for Monday, south winds at 30 knots for Shemya and Attu, Kiska Island, Amchitka, west winds at 25 knots. Northwest small craft advisory winds for the central Aleutians, for 25-30 knot winds from the northwest. Also for Unmak Island, Unalaska Island, northwest at 20 with 6 to 10 foot seas. And for the Pribilofs on Sunday, south winds at 10 knots with 4 foot seas. That's where the winds will be the lightest here. And otherwise, small craft advisories for St. Lawrence and St. Matthew Islands, northeast 25 knots, 6 to 9 foot seas. Yukon Delta Coast, east winds of 15, and southeast 15 for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. On Monday, north at 20 for St. Lawrence Island, northwest 20 for the Yukon Delta Coast. South and Nunivak Island, north winds 15 knots with the Pribilof St. Matthew Island zones, north winds at 20 knots with 7 foot seas. And heading up to the north there from Wales to Cape Beaufort, we've got small craft advisories for 25 knot winds from the north-northeast and seas running at about 6 feet. Western Arctic coast, northeast at 20 knots, 10 knots on the central coast, and then east-northeast 20 knots again for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast with 4 foot seas. Those will be northeast 15 for the east side there on Monday. Still light, northeast at 10 for the central coast, picking up to 15 on the west side. Cape Beaufort to Cape Thompson, north at 20 knots. Cape Thompson to Wales, north 25, good for small craft advisories with 7 foot seas. For tonight, low clouds, fog, and drizzle along the Arctic coast, maybe the north slope, but mostly along the coast. Rain on the increase there with flood watches out for the Chattanooga and Little Chena rivers, as well as along the Elliott Highway and eastern Alaska Range, including Isabel Pass. And also a flood warning out until early this evening for Mendenhall Lake and the river near Juneau. Otherwise, periods of rain continue there for the Panhandle, and a wet day tomorrow for southern Alaska and the Panhandle and up the east side of the eastern interior to the Arctic coast. And more rain for Kodiak Island moving in on Monday or Sunday night. Monday as that low tracks across the Alaska Peninsula. It stays wet, cloudy, and cool over southern Alaska. A little drier to the north and wet again over the southeast coast. High pressure builds in ahead of the next system, pushing in toward the Komodorskis.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.